The African Institute of International Affairs joins us to unpack these stakes for Africa. Thank you so much for the time, Elizabeth. Really appreciate you joining us this morning. Let's just talk about Africa and even the AU's inclusion in G20 and a lot of these conversations. How has that truly shifted the role of Africa in global decision-making? Good morning.
Good morning, Arabile. So I think what is very important to note, of course, is that the way in which South Africa structured its agenda for the G20, I think, took into consideration the priorities and the concerns of the African continent. Whether it is about digital public infrastructure, with your insert just now, and artificial intelligence, and how we can ensure that the African continent and other members of the global South are not left behind, to the prioritization also of dealing with the issue of debt and debt sustainability, given that so many African countries are either in debt distress or nearing debt distress, and also the prioritization of climate finance, but specifically related to adaptation and disaster risk. All of those have really put all of those priorities really enabled the African continent more broadly to really sort of articulate and amplify the issues that concern it on the global stage in the G20, where you have, you know, some of the most important economies in the world. I think it has shifted some of the debate and some of the outcomes. This has been a process. So if we're looking at development finance more broadly, there has been an incremental, I think, amplification of the need to provide more finance, development finance, for the last 4 or 5 years. It's gone through progressive presidencies. Hopefully, if we get a leaders' declaration at the end of this week, we might see some concrete commitments from the leaders. But the point here, either way, is that I think with the AU being part of the G20, with South Africa chairing it, I think at the very least we have really used the platform to strongly push for many of the priorities and recommendations that are coming out of the African continent.
Does the leadership declaration or the leaders' declaration mark the only way of success that South Africa really has pushed the agenda forward, that the global South has been a key cornerstone of the conversations being had?
Not necessarily. I know that a lot of the discussions over the last few weeks have been on whether there will be a leaders' declaration, whether the US will allow that, so to speak. Of course, the decisions there are made by consensus, and we can talk a little about that. But you know, we have found, in fact, over many years, that the leaders, putting something into the leaders' declaration, even if you have a leaders' declaration, doesn't necessarily mean that the implementation is going to happen. One of the issues that has come out of the G20 at 20 review, which was another of the priorities of the South African government, is that in some areas, implementation has not been as effective or as efficient. In the finance track, interestingly, which is one of the 2 tracks of the G20, specifically around the issue of multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank, etc., there has been some progress where the G20 members have also encouraged the World Bank to embark on its evolution roadmap, to really increase its ability to lend to developing countries. So there have been some area, and of course there's also the debt issue, which where you have a G20 agreement, even if not everybody's on the same page, but you're in some of the details, but you can push these through the IMF, the World Bank, etc. So it's not essential. It is symbolic that you have an outcome. I know we're talking now about the possibility that the US will say, well, we're not there, this cannot be a leaders' declaration. But there are other ways of driving this agenda forward in the formal multilateral spaces, like the World Bank, the IMF, where there can be some action.
Yeah, very significant there. Can the AU continue to amplify Africa's voice? And I only ask that because there are always internal divisions within the African Union itself. Africa itself is not always united. But could the AU still continue to drive the African voice within the G20 beyond this edition of this global showpiece?
So the first thing to bear in mind is that, as I said earlier, the G20 is a process. So we have put some issues on the agenda, which hopefully we can drive forward, not just in 2026, even if 2026 is difficult, but beyond. The second point to make about the AU is that, of course, the AU itself is a body it's an intergovernmental body. It's not supranational, doesn't have any supranational powers in the way that the European Union does. But it has, on some issues, been able to formulate a common position for Africa. The most notable and the most recent has been the Lome conference on debt earlier this year, where there was a common position that was articulated. There are areas where we are in agreement. We are in agreement, for example, on using the special drawing rights of the IMF in innovative ways to be able to raise more finance and so on. So there are there are areas where we can prioritize and we have a common position. The third point, of course, I want to make is that it is very important that across the continent, so in the member states, we really build up a greater awareness and understanding of the issues on the G20 agenda and how we can use the G20 to amplify in other multilateral forums some of the points that we want to drive on climate finance, on debt, etc. And it obviously also has to be that the AU Commission itself ramps up its capacity to play an important technical role as well as political role. So it's only 2 years since the AU has been in the G20. I think it is a process. As long as we keep our eyes on the points that I've identified, I think that amplification can happen, albeit in an increasingly difficult geopolitical context.
One might say it's a little bit easier to have this conversation, especially with South Africa in the mix and leading and having the chairmanship and presidency of the G20 this year. Next year it moves to the United States. Can we continue to play some sort of ground? What mechanisms could be in place to ensure that South Africa, or maybe the G20 commitments actually, on debt, particularly on infrastructure, all of those actually reach African nations? What mechanisms could be in place for that?
So obviously next year will be, I think, a different presidency. I think it's going to be a more pared down presidency. It's clear that the US will focus considerably on the finance track and on particular elements of the finance track. But the one thing we must remember is that a lot of these commitments made by the G20 through consensus also depend on how individual countries or bodies actually execute them. So it might be that in the case of in next year and in the case of some of these initiatives, the US is not keen to engage or to participate. There are, in some instances, actions that, say, the European Union can take or China can take using its policy banks and other financial instruments, if we're talking about finances, to help achieve some of the objectives of being able to increase the development finance available to the developing world. So it's not, the G20 itself is not an implementing agency. It doesn't have a secretariat.
Yeah.
The commitments are voluntary. In some instances, you will need US support. That's very clear, and I think there it's going to be very difficult. But in other areas, it might be possible for countries who have committed to these things to move forward. And then one also has to think about sort of 2027 and 2028.
Yeah.
Sometimes things go into hibernation and they're picked up again by subsequent presidencies. And I think there is no reason to sort of see that this would necessarily be different. But that the G20 next year, I think, is going to take a different turn, much smaller, much more focused on financial issues, and certainly also perhaps walking back some of the issues that have made progress over the last few years. If we just think of the focus on sustainable development, or indeed on climate change, and on regulation, financial regulation, to ensure that we don't enter into another financial crisis. I suspect some of these will be handled differently by the US.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for the